And does our approach to leadership cause creativity and innovation to blossom or to die on the vine? So in many ways, distributed leadership is about distributed innovation and distributed creativity. So, Peter, welcome to podcast number 2 on this topic of distributed leadership. And because it's a week later after our first recording, I've had some time to noodle on it, to review the first podcast, and it's an interesting concept. And I know you and I had exchanged some potential questions and discussion topics, but I'm going to hit you with one that just came up this morning. Actually, someone else brought it up to me. Are you familiar? And I know this is going to be maybe a curveball. Are you familiar with the name Curtis Yarvin?
Yes, actually, it's on my list to really look at the work that he is doing in the democracy space.
So Curtis Yarvin, for those of you who aren't familiar, I mean, he's a Silicon Valley guru, but I would call him the anti-distributed leadership guy. I mean, he is absolutely advocating that in the United States, there's a shift from a democracy model to more of a monarchy model. What I'm intrigued by is how much traction he's getting. I mean, because I think it does speak to how enticing it is for some people to think, oh, we just need a really smart person in charge. We just need the Uber leader. And if we just can get the right Uber leader, then all this other messy stuff will get taken care of. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think I think we are seeing a global trend toward totalitarianism for exactly the reasons that you're mentioning. Is we've never had to face this level of complexity. I mean, the CEO of Anthropic thinks that the vast majority of entry-level jobs will disappear over the next couple of years. With this technology, this is and we're just starting to see whole sectors of employment disappear. I mean, Google's DeepMind created AlphaFold, which is an AI model specifically for predicting how proteins will fold. Well, there's a whole host of PhD students, that's their thesis. There's a whole host of researchers who that's their work. All of that just went away, a couple of years ago. And so these are very niche positions, but we're starting to see this technology advance. People are justifiably scared. Now, we've faced the same fear at every major point of view. People thought with factories, well, where will people work? What will happen? I mean, the whole Luddite movement. So I think we have to recognize, A, this is very predictable, and B, it's natural. Who doesn't want a savior, a Superman to come and make everything better?
Actually, I'm going to say, I'll raise my hand and say, I do not. I have worked in environments, even with like really, really bright men or women who I feel like, okay, I'm comfortable with her in charge or him in charge. I still don't work well in that kind of environment. I don't react well to that kind of environment. I do not want a savior. I'm not a good soldier. So the distributed leadership entices me. When I think of distributed leadership, both from the leader's seat and from the follower's seat, it just feels more right. But I know that I can be leaning into my own bias as well because it feels more comfortable for me.
Well, I think that is that is the crux. But I think right now we are afraid, and we do not have the right structures to allow for movement through the problems that we have.
Yeah.
And I think the tools that we used 20 years ago, I don't know how effective they were 20 years ago, but they're definitely completely ineffective now. And we haven't really adapted, and from a government standpoint. So the idea of a strong person, usually a man, to come and save it all, very attractive. Yeah, very, very attractive. to a lot of people. But
Well,
as you and I both know, it won't work. It's too complex. And you can start to
and
see
so
the
then,
breakdowns of some of these companies right now.
yeah.
Like they don't see certain things. Meta, I don't think will recover. I think they will. I don't think they will. I think they've done too much damage. I think the ship has passed on what they are trying to accomplish because of their single-mindedness
Mhm.
of their leadership. I think the same thing with Amazon. I don't think, and we all see what's happening at Google. They're under existential threat, throwing AI at everything they can possibly
Mhm.
throw it at to try and figure it out. So, this kind of control work, we're seeing it's not working. We're hoping it will by that push toward authoritarianism. It won't. Yeah.
And so distributed leadership in many ways becomes the vessel for distributed innovation, distributed energy and passion, distributed culture. It's distributed a lot of things. But let me ask you, how is it, as you define distributed leadership, how is it different or more than simply good good leadership delegation? I know it's more than that, but I think that's one of the easy like questions. Like, are we just talking delegation?
No, yeah, definitely not with delegation, because the delegation assumes that there is one person or one group of people who has the understanding of the complexity of the landscape to
Yeah.
dole out responsibilities as they see fit and as are necessary. And distributed leadership really looks at, well, no, people are very capable across the board, right? They can figure out what it is they need to know. However, they do need structure to do this. So I think there's two examples that I'd like to bring up. So my office was on 11 Broadway during 9/11, and just not far from the World Trade Center. Just
Mhm.
we're right across the Statue of the Bull, maybe less than half a mile from the World Trade Center. And we were in the thick of it, and I kept my team in the office during the worst of it until it was declared that it was safe to go out, and that was the right thing to do, and I was pleased with that. But when we were leaving, and I remember we turned one corner, it was the most beautiful day, and there was white on the ground. It looked like it just snowed, but it was, of course, ash. But it was the most perfectly beautiful day. And we turned one corner, and there was just a sea of people who were dirty and ash covered and walking out of downtown. And during that scene, people came out of their houses with jugs of water and cups. They invited people up to their house to use the bathroom. There was a sneaker store owner who was giving women
Mhm.
sneakers who had high heels. No one needed to tell those people to do that, right? They saw a need and they felt
Right.
to do something about it. And so when we look at delegation, we need people to delegate, to tell us what to do, to give us that, where many of us know what to do. And if we don't, we need frameworks to allow for that. So it is actually the absence of that. Distributed leaders are the absence of someone saying, you do this, you do that, which happens based on trust, right? But we take that trust the next step forward. It is, I trust you, to know to do the right thing, whether it be based on my relationship with you or based on the structure we've created, or most likely a mixture of both. So we went back, we talked about turn the ship around, right? That naval captain, the submarine captain gave them a
Mhm.
framework. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but they knew within certain boundaries they had to consider certain things. So if they
Yeah.
made a decision, it needed to hit those. Now they still went to their captain and said, "This is the situation. This is
Yeah.
this is my solution, and here's how it fits into our framework."
They
And
understand command
yeah,
intent, and if and ensure that what you're recommending is in alignment with command intent, although it may look quite different than the actual command.
exactly. So, which brings me to something else that we mentioned in our discussion. It requires a lot of structure, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is the hard part, is creating that structure, because there's no template for it. This is something. There's an organization that came up with a concept called Holacracy, and they were a small software company, and they figured out a distributed model that worked for their industry, their company, their culture. And it was great for them. But then they productized the system, and Zappos adopted it. And it was a complete failure. Zappos got rid of it because it was interfering with their ability to provide good customer service. No, this was a system created for another environment applied to a completely different environment. No shock that it was a failure in my mind.
Well, speaking of structure, because it's one of those topics that's easy to blow past, to think, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's important to have good structure, but in fact, I think you and I would both agree, more often than not, organizations have fuzzy structure where accountabilities are not clear, authority is not clear, things, and oftentimes that structure has grown organically. You might have a situation where you have a particularly strong employee who's produced particularly great results, and over time, the formal org structure has evolved into giving that person more responsibility, more accountability, and then others. I mean, I see this to this day in some organizations, where in other pockets of the business, the accountability shrinks. So it evolves because we see good stuff happening here. I don't have as much confidence here as the key leader, but then those people move on. That person moves on, and we replace them. This person moves on and replace them, and over time, our evolved accountability structure is mismatched against the actual humans that are in those roles, and then we wonder, why does it seem there are three people driving this bus, and who drives growth? Is it sales? Is it marketing? Who's accountable? There are all kinds of questions. And so what would be, I guess, in your mind, what is the key to developing a clear structure that's aligned with the principles of distributed leadership?
Yeah, that's the trick, right? Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I realized is when I was being asked the question, if distributed leadership's so great, why aren't there more companies like Buurtzorg and Morningstar and Gore who are doing it? And I think that is the for me, what I've seen is when I look at the companies that have been incredibly successful using distributed leadership, they look nothing like each other. And then I look at instances of Zappos and many other companies that have tried to adopt holacracy or quickly transition to other methods of distributed leadership and fail. And what I realized is this is not a system to adopt, but rather an operating system to build over time. Mm-hmm. And so if I would never be able to prescribe, Procter & Gamble, this is how your organizational structure should work, or, InfoPro, this is how your distributed organizations go. I think that that's something that needs to be created, within the company in a distributed manner, and starting slow to move fast. So if you look at Buurtzorg, right, or Morningstar, or any of these companies, they were founded on the principles of distributed leadership. I mean, Doug Kirkpatrick, the founding CFO of Morningstar, tells a story of being, around a kitchen table in a trailer, where the founder said, how can we create a company where no one has the right to tell anybody else what to do? That was the origin story. And it began with that conversation, trying to figure that out. And what happened over the next several years is a lot of experimentations, some of which were successful. I would imagine the majority of which were not. Yeah, and it is through that process of trying something out that allowed them to figure out what worked for their culture, their industry, their customer base, their regulatory environment. And it's going to have to be different in each organization. So what I and my partners recommend is starting with the executive team. And I think the first thing that executive team needs to experience is they don't know everything that they need to know to do that. Mm-hmm. And how I go about accomplishing that is starting off with a series of mapping exercises. Procter & Gamble's challenge mapping, right? Mm-hmm. Do we understand the challenge that we are trying to face? Are we in alignment of that challenge? Often executive teams, they only think they are. They're using the same language, but they're not aligned. And then with their understanding of the challenge, they realize that they don't know everything that they need to know. And then using tools like Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework and his affordance mapping. What is it that my organization can afford to do? What are we actually capable of? And do we know that? Most executives actually aren't clear on that. They're probably like me, highly optimistic. They think they can do anything. Not always the case. So what are the things that our organization can afford? And then what is the very nature of this plan? Can we do it? And then using a methodology called strategic doing, which is a non-hierarchical project management methodology, where it's designed for highly chaotic or complex projects where there are many causes of what you're trying to deal with and many possible solutions, and they're changing over time. Will you bring people together who have expertise in that area, and you're starting with an appreciative inquiry and looking at what assets is this team willing to contribute to this effort? How do you combine those assets so they're more than the sum of their parts? And then what can you do with those assets to move you closer to your inquiry, to make progress? And then you're passing off leadership, not based on seniority, not based on role, but on who excels in the different leadership position traits that are necessary at any given time. And through that passing off of reconfiguring who's working on projects after every spring cycle, of producing results together, of seeing employees who have talents and capabilities that you never thought possible, you start to realize, oh wait, there's something more capable here. And we see when we do this, it works well. So you can start to gradually distribute authority based on trust, based on understanding, right? It's what makes the military so effective in implementing concepts of distributed leadership, like the concept of team of teams or turn the ship around, is because everyone has the same language. They know what they mean, what they speak. And so through that process of the mapping exercise and distributed strategic doing, you gain that trust, you gain that opportunity. You start slow so that you can eventually move fast.
It does. It seems a little counterintuitive that the military that is so hierarchical and so structured, actually, with a leader who has a vision in mind of distributed leadership, the leader can drive in that direction relatively quickly, as long as that vision is communicated effectively. And also, when we talk about command intent, what's clear is there, at least in the military, I guess, version of distributed leadership, it is definitely not the inmates leading the asylum. It's not. There is a command intent. There is a direction, how to execute, how to envision, how to make that vision a reality. That's where there's freedom. But I imagine that the boundaries of that distributed leadership are very well defined. You can lead up to this, but not beyond. Or if you don't agree with the vision, here's the method for circling back, and let's reassess and rediscuss, and we might make an adjustment. But what's the old phrase when you looked at ancient maps? Beyond this, there be
dragons. Yeah.
Defining where the dragons are, and now it's time to back up and have a discussion, as opposed to just leading wherever you want to take the ship, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that, but it's also you raise a really interesting point. I mean, how much time do CEOs have to actually think and strategize? Not a lot. Right, they're pulled in so many directions. They have such human brain cannot hold more than about 7 or 8 concepts at any given time. Where CEOs are responsible for thousands of different points. Right, it is a job that is built on failure, but so much so on the whims. Right, I mean, I find is that an investor says something, it can change everything for a company. You and I have careers with working with large companies. We see that they'll get on just a train where, Goldman's doing it this way, and then everybody starts doing it that way, but no one quite realizes it's not such a good idea. It's just but it's there's so much whim happening right now that I think, and that people don't acknowledge, which I find terrifying.
So I'll admit that in my life, as I thought through last week's discussion, I've experienced unintentional distributed leadership in the past, where because a leader was not driving to any degree, the divisions or departments that I was leading, I just did it. I just went ahead and did what I thought made sense, and it worked out. But I definitely, I'm going to be honest, I definitely went past the beyond here there be dragon stage. I went rogue. I led my division and department the way I thought it made sense, and there were some clear areas where I was just going off, but because it produced results, nobody came to whack me on the head, and life was good. But that, I'd call that was unintentional distributed leadership. And at the same time that I was producing results, there were other divisions that not so great. And then, not surprisingly, that particular company was bought out by KKR. This was back in the 90s, and KKR did what they do. They create hyper efficiency by just selling bits and pieces off, and maximizing shareholder or investor return. But with that in mind, let me ask, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Meaning, is it leader mindset first, or is it follower mindset first? Because the followers have to have a certain mindset to embrace the distributed leadership, because a lot of followers, like we said at the beginning, they view that strong leader as almost a warm, comfortable blanket. I don't have to make the tough calls. I don't have to take the tough risks. I don't have to step out. I can just do what I'm told to do. So, you can have a leader who decides, hey, I'm going to embrace this mindset of distributed leadership. But if his or her followers aren't ready, it's still not going to work. And I know there's no one answer. I keep asking you, like, what's the key? And of course, there's not the key, but any guidance in terms of what comes first, what has to come first?
I think so. There is the majority of actions that I see come from an enlightened leader. So Haier, the Chinese appliance manufacturing firm that owns GE Appliances, like their leader was at a point of crisis, right? Forgetting his name off the top of my head, but he was, his ability to innovate was next to nothing. They were not producing great qualities. Their earnings were about half. Their profitability was about half of that of what was Maytag, and they just couldn't figure it out. And they had a huge, heavily bloated middle management, and now their goal was to make everyone an entrepreneur. And I think so that goal came first. How do I tap into the entrepreneurial spirit that already exists within my company, and creating structures to foment that? And then that led to a cascade, across the organization, through those changes. And but that was, an enlightened leader. I think we look at Buurtzorg, the home health aid company in the Netherlands. Well, these were 3 home health aid nurses who were sick and tired of being controlled and having every action that they took, giving specific time limits and specific reactions to situations, and realizing it often flew in the face of what their patients actually needed. So in a reaction to that very, very intense control, they opened it up, but based on certain principles. We're looking for health independence and community connection for their patients. And so they built a structure around that need. The founder of Morningstar, he's an intense libertarian. It was a political belief that he was like, well, let's do an experiment, see if we can, create a company based on these principles. Little did he know it'd be ridiculously successful, because of that decision, because it wasn't just his brilliance pointing the direction, it was the brilliance of everyone in the organization. Doug tells a story about how, the mechanic, the guy who fixes the stuff is like, I was thinking last night, I realized that if we just move the order of our, of how we're processing our stuff, we could save a lot of money. The plant, on a weekend, just moved around all their equipment, as a result of this idea, ended up saving something like $10 million a year. So but these are things that happened over time. It's not like, okay, we're going to change the org chart and your reporting structure and this, and now the magic happens. it is in the creation of those structures where the magic happens. And then also the employees who say, hey, this is no longer working. Yeah, long before the executives realize it, they say, hey, let's experiment with some changes, and then propagating it through that. And I think that is the key. And as far as accountability, in the military, what do they say that their soldiers fight for? Not for their country, not for their generals, it's for the person next to them. I think it's the same thing in the workplace, right? That it is this connection of who we work with and the dependent teams who we interact with. If our boss is disappointed in us, we might be in trouble. But if our colleagues are if we've let them down, never, right? And I think that it creates a very, very different environment.
I think one of the other things I've seen in, I guess what I'll call organically distributed leadership organizations, where like Morningstar, I heard a phrase years ago, it's easier to give birth than to raise the dead. And sometimes when you're launching a business, or you're in the early stages of the business, you can build something out from a blank page so much more easily than if you've got a culture that's embedded, if you've got a structure that's embedded. That's a lot tougher, but that's probably the more common circumstance. I mean, most of the people listening to this podcast will be in organizations where there is a current structure, there's a current hierarchy, there's a current way of thinking, and the idea of changing may intellectually make sense, but it's actually so much more difficult than almost anything you might have read in another business book or a leadership book. More complicated than Good to Great. I mean, the principles within Good to Great, every one of them was made so much sense that any one of them you could say, hey, everybody, we want to execute this. And people would come on board. Whereas distributed leadership has a lot of subtleties to it and a lot of counterintuitive points to distributed leadership, which I suppose is why people hire consultants like yourself to come in, because sometimes you're too close to it, or sometimes you just don't see clearly your own organization. So maybe tell us just a little bit about the work that you've done or the experiences you've had where you've been able to guide organizations and individuals in that direction.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think the work of consultants is to bring their expertise and to impose it on an organization. And I think that's what most consultants do. They come up with a methodology and they just, stamp it out in many organizations. And incidentally, I think it's why people don't really like working with consultants all of that much. I take a very different approach. I believe that that organizations have everything that they need in order to succeed and overcome the challenges that they face within the organization. So my work is not saying, let me tell you how to do distributed leadership, but how do I help you create the structures that allow for that to happen, for you to be able to tap into that insight. So because if we look at how the landscape is changing, we have these new technologies, they're emergent. We have no idea how they will impact us, right? Like, those PhD students who are overwhelmed by Google DeepMind, they had no idea that was coming. And we have yet to see how this will change the world. It is an emergent property, but also as these technological waves come closer and closer together, they're going to start to merge and create entirely new waves. So these recombinant technologies, for example, like we've seen that robotics is merged with generative AI, making something that was intensely difficult to use and deploy easy to pretty much anyone can use it. So these emergent opportunities and these and threats, these recombinant opportunities and threats, we don't know how to deal with them. Our current leadership will definitely fail because they do not understand the problem. And in fact, no one does. So we need to, and so the mapping exercise that I mentioned starts this process. One, there are tools that do not need expertise to deploy. You learn them, you can do them, and you can create strategies on the back of a napkin based on using these tools. So, starting with that executive team, fundamentally seeing, how they
Yeah.
work, because most leaders think that they are adaptive, abundant leaders, right? But they're not. They're nice people who think they're approachable, right?
Mhm.
And but they don't realize that their position keeps them from being approachable. So there's this disconnect in how they see themselves and how the world sees them. That they're just not aware of, because they're just seeing themselves as they always did. And this is a trap that I've fallen into, and I've seen others.
There's
Yeah.
so many layers to this then, because you're right. For lack of a better word, the bubble that leaders exist in creates this artificial state where you probably convince yourself that you are in fact practicing distributed leadership, because you're telling everybody, practice distributed leadership. I don't want to drive those decisions. I want you to step up and drive those decisions. You can say all the right things, and since I have directed my team to act distributed, I may not be good at recognizing the difference between acting distributed, but actually still following orders, and actually being distributed, and actually taking true ownership of whatever my arena might be. That's a that's a very self-aware leader who can see through that bubble. Um, uh,
Well, and that's the purpose of those mapping exercises. They're getting
yeah.
clarity on strategy, but they are, and I think this is, from my perspective, I had that same, and I think I mentioned last time. There was a problem. Here I was, 2019. I thought, oh, I'm this adaptive leader. I, push control to the furthest reaches of my organizations, and then I ran into this massive problem that was created entirely by my distrust of my team in India that was doing
Mhm.
our recruiting and sourcing. And I had justified this. It made sense. It was logical, and it was dead wrong. And I didn't see it. And it was a very expensive mistake that caused me a lot of pain and suffering. And it was, I think it was very, very expensive. And it all came from, rather than me saying, this is the framework for you to determine quality
Mhm.
and make decisions. I didn't do that. I said, oh, I dictated rather than negotiated. It
Well,
made
and
sense. I was
I'm
doing
going
it.
through a similar challenge right now where I have a team that I really do need them, particularly the team leaders. I need the team leaders to take on more ownership of their particular functions, and they should be able to. But um, so far, what I've had to do is direct that effort. I've basically had to say, I can't be the bottleneck. I don't want to be the bottleneck. You need to own those functions. And when the question comes back, well, do you want to review? Before we release something, do you want to review it? Um, and I'm struggling with that right now, because if I say yes, I do know the mindset that that's going to create. If I say yes, I'm going to review everything before it actually gets released. That actually means one thing. Whereas on the other hand, if I say no, I don't want to be the bottleneck. How do I ensure that before something gets released, there's been some quality control? There's a certain amount of trust that has to go with that. And also, then what I'm responsible for is ensuring that those individuals have the competencies to be distributed leaders. Again, that's just harder.
It
It's
is.
it's so much easier just to say, okay, I'll review it. Oh, that wrong, right, 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 wrong, wrong. Fix those three things, and then you go forth and lead. But they're not really leading. So I'm experiencing the pain of trying to be true to
Yeah.
the spirit of distributed leadership, but recognizing how hard that is.
Yeah, and ultimately, you're in this half place, right? You're in a command and control structure. So if you distribute leadership and they screw it up, it's on you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a difficult thing, right?
Mhm.
But so what I would recommend is saying, is sitting with them and saying, okay, so this is the dynamic we're in. There's certain things that I know that you don't, and we don't know what are the things that I know and the things
Mhm.
that you don't. So how do we build in real time a framework as we're going through this
Yeah.
process that we are identifying, whether it be a checklist or a framework, for you to be able to determine what it is that's necessary? Because remember back to Turn the Ship Around, when he would ask a series of questions, and then when people started coming to him with those answers pre-populated, he stopped asking questions and said, go ahead. But now he knew what those questions were. You and I don't in most of those situations.
Right.
But it is that process of, we want to get to a point where you team can figure out, yes, this is a release and we're just going to go through it. So let's figure that out together. So rather than me reviewing it and saying, what's that? Let's review it. And I'll start off by asking questions about things that you've done. And from those questions, we'll begin to create a process for you to be able to determine that. And then who is and then this is the critical component. Who on the team is going to be accountable for that process being followed? And I think that the example that I love with that is the Michigan Health and Hospitals Corporation had the worst hospital infection rates in the country. They were killing a lot of people and it was very expensive. And they instituted a 4-step checklist to avoid it. And it was started off with wash your hands. Very, very simple stuff. There was nothing complex about it. Make sure that the patient has clean drapings around the wound that you're working with. There's about 4 steps, that needed to be followed. Now, what do we know about processes? People follow in the beginning and then they start to assume. So what they did was they put nurses as the enforcer of this checklist. And they empowered nurses to do whatever the heck they needed to do to make sure that checklists were followed. So you had nurses hip checking doctors out of the way in a hospital situation where doctors are the captains of the ship. They don't get told that they're doing wrong. But in this situation, I didn't see him wash his hands. Knock him out of the way. Don't let him touch the patient, right? And it was that, that you were distributing the authority of who could enforce this checklist. That was the thing that pushed it forward. So, accountability is important, but how we manage that accountability, and do so is the question, and it needs a lot of thought.
The senior leader for one of the client organizations that I work with, I would call him an unintentional distributed leader, because he's never used that term. I think like the CEO of Morningstar, it just springs naturally from who he is. And the way his mind operates. But he did say to me, I let people know what they own, and then what I own is ensuring they have the capability to carry out what they own. So I'm accountable for their capabilities. They're accountable for the outcomes. And he said, occasionally we'll have a not so great outcome, but I keep it very clear. My fault, for lack of a better word, is I didn't ensure or foster or enable you having those capabilities. Your fault, for lack of a better word, is in the actual outcome. And so it's a shared responsibility for that particular outcome, and we're going to fix it together. I'm going to focus on building capabilities within you, and you're going to focus on producing the results. But again, that sprang naturally from him. And so his organization was very much used to that sense of distributed accountability and distributed leadership.
Well, I would imagine, and I think this is where the shift is going to come. I think it is going to come from leaders like that who have stumbled on it, or leaders who said, this isn't working and we need to go for a more distributed model. And I mean, let's look at the results that distributed organizations produce, right? They have drastically lower overhead because they don't have all the managerial roles. In certain cases, up to 40%. So those companies who are spending 40% less on overhead, what will they do with that extra profitability? They're going to buy up market share. They're going to threaten, as Buurtzorg did. They got 80% market share in 12 years. They've in a highly regulated market. There's no way that those competitors aren't questioning their very existence after losing that much market share and looking to make changes. And so this is what I think will happen. It's what I call the Deming effect, is that people will use the market forces to create mass market change. And I think, particularly when you look at the AI coding capabilities that are just coming out, right? 90% of it used to be that the Standard and Poor's industrial average, the companies on that were valued based on physical asset. Not long ago, just in the 70s, things like factories and equipment and buildings and stuff, that was the value of companies. Now it's all 90% of that value is intangible. Things like brands and patents and software. What does that mean when 90% of the value, up to 90% of the value of a corporation is made up of software, most of it written 30 years ago, and someone can, just by speaking into a microphone, build and recreate the software that makes up 90% of those companies? What's going to happen then? Right? This is an intractable problem that we are, maybe 2 or 3 years away from seeing in full force. Companies that can't deal, and many of them won't survive. And those companies that are able to hang on will need to make massive changes really, really quickly. So I think it is a chicken or an egg, or the meteor that destroyed the dinosaurs and created the opportunity for something new. And I think that meteor is very, very close.
One of the reasons I think you may fail as a consultant is because the message is hard. You're asking leaders to think more deeply, to see more fully, like see past the bubble. You're asking them to do all the hard things, which we all kind of intellectually know that we should be doing, but it's hard. It takes time and energy. And in this flow of fast, complex business, it's just so much easier to say, hey, just get it done. I'm just going to delegate. I'm the thinking time, the real thinking time, I think has been diminished more and more and more. I even find that with AI, as complex as AI can be, the promise of AI was it could free us up. It could free us up to do more of the deep thinking, but it doesn't seem to have done that, at least not yet. If anything, it just takes us down more rabbit holes of thought. We need an AI strategy. We need a digital strategy. We need this. We need this. We need this. And to some degree, I've seen, and this may just be my world, but I've seen CEOs feel like it's on their shoulders because no one else is grabbing onto the AI strategy for their business. Even IT feels threatened by it, so IT may create an AI strategy of some kind, but not a compelling, competitive AI strategy. I don't know. Does that prompt any thoughts?
Yes. I think the creation of an AI strategy is the perfect test case for something like distributed leadership, or the simple. I mean, look at the number of the amount of people who report that they are using AI, creating automations to do their jobs, but they're not telling their supervisors.
Right.
So for organizations who are like scratching their heads saying, well, what should our AI strategy be? Be like, you've already got one. You just don't know it yet. And the problem is when those people leave, they're taking that AI strategy with them. So finding some way to engage, we're like, how is it that we can use these tools? To not everybody's going to admit like, oh, well, I'm no longer writing. I've created this GPT that allows me to write in the format that I need to, and I just put the inputs in and it comes out. And I've been just really coaching my kids' games, and now they're going to the Pee Wee World Series. As a result, not everyone's going to cop that, but enough will. To say, oh, well, I'm doing this, and what we could do, and using that experience to say, oh, wow, well, these people are so much more capable. Let's see how we can build on those things.
But if you're not discerning, I've got a couple of senior marketing folks who they're individual contributors, and we've had this conversation where they are very actively leveraging various tools, from ChatGPT to Claude to Notebook LM, and they're using them in various ways, and their methodology, you can take their exact workflow, their exact methodology, and you can get excited about it. But if you gave that workflow or methodology to a relatively new person who doesn't know the customer as well, who doesn't know the market, who doesn't have this vast subject matter expertise. They can get excited because ChatGPT will produce something that to that newbie looks amazing. It's oh man, that's fantastic. And yet the discerning eye will say, well, all
It's
you're
dead
really
wrong.
doing, you just wrote a LinkedIn article that sounds like 1,000 other LinkedIn articles. Like where's the essence? Where's the sense of something unique there? Whereas the more experienced individuals will take that output and will be able to, with very modest tweaks and adjustments, create something that's truly beautiful and insightful, but because they have the expertise to truly use the tool as a tool, not as a crutch. And it's hard to know how much expertise does somebody need in order to leverage AI as a true enhancement tool and not a crutch.
Yeah, yeah. But I think collaboration, is the
Yeah.
key on something like that, right? And I think that is, where we need to keep our focus is because I think that area of I mean, the CEO of Anthropic last week said that he thought the vast majority of entry level jobs will disappear in the next couple of
Uh-huh.
years. I think that's ridiculous. I think entry level jobs as we know them right now will definitely disappear. But I think what we're assuming is that AI will eliminate the need for that.
Well,
No, it will
what
raise
happens
all-
then when that layer of subject matter experts eventually retires? I mean, we all do eventually go away. We try to stay relevant for as long as possible. You and I are both, playing an end game where we're trying to be as relevant as long as possible. But at a certain point, we go away. If you haven't fostered and nurtured your entry level employees to develop that level of subject matter expertise, I don't know what happens then. Then there may be the ultimate disaster where nobody actually knows how anything's working. It seems to be working on autopilot, but nobody knows what it's actually doing. So maybe though that speaks to, in the past, you get an entry level job and you do, you learn on the job. And I know I've been guilty of this, hiring people, giving them relatively simple tasks and assignments, and just assuming you're going to learn from this. You're going to do some things well, some things not so well. You'll get feedback and you'll learn. We may have to get much more thoughtful about our onboarding and how do we create that subject matter expertise much faster in the new generations potentially. Can you?
More thoughtful about our onboarding, and that's a really important thing, right? Because we need to be, and I think that this is one of the things that is broken about hiring, right? We view it in this very purchasing mentality. We apply this simple process of buying stuff to this really complex process, but what happens is we overemphasize skills, and knowledge, through that process. So like it is culture that allows someone to work successfully, a cultural match, within an organization. But that's almost always the last thing that is looked at from a recruiting standpoint.
Yeah.
And after you've gone through so many candidates, you're desperate to hire this person, you do a quick check to see if they're a cultural fit and basically cross your fingers and hope it works out, as opposed to starting there, right? And I think particularly for distributed organizations, making sure people are aligned from a cultural standpoint is so much more critical, right? That you have people who are capable of interacting in a collaborative environment. Not everyone is, and that you're bringing people who have the same, they're motivated by the same things as their teammates are, or similar things, and you can do all of that with incredible diversity of thought, right? People who share the same values can think very, very differently. So making sure that you have that diversity of thinking so that you're not, that person who what good quality looks like when it comes to a course, and one of your teammates might have a piece of that understanding, but you want the one who has the other piece who will say, wait a second, what about this? And bring those different perspectives that you've gained, over an impressive career. You can't replicate that in one person, but maybe you can replicate it in four.
Quite possibly. And there's a lot of talk now within the learning and development community about developing skills-based organizations, and to a large degree it all makes sense, but we may be in the process of over-indexing toward becoming a skills-based organization, because we think, oh, if I just define the skills required for a position, and then, like you said, I'm going to go to the recruiting marketplace and I'm going to, oh, I need 3 tomatoes and 2 oranges and a banana and a pear. And I'm just going to pick someone who's got those specific skills. And we forget that, oh, wait a minute. Didn't we used to know that while skills are important, grit is more important? Emotional intelligence is more important. Discernment is more important. Those things that are very hard to quantify. So as we drift toward being a skills-based organization, potentially we're forgetting that humans are so much more complex than that, and there's a lot more. And then feeding back into distributed leadership. Distributed leadership requires, for the followers to be ready for distributed leadership, they need those intangible qualities as much as the actual skills themselves.
Well, when Gallup looks at the main reasons for disengagement, which we're at 78% of global employees are disengaged. It's trillions and trillions of dollars of wasted productivity every year. There's 2 things that consistently come up. Employees want meaning and agency. They want to know that their work means something, and they want some say in how it's applied. So I would assert that the vast majority of employees are already desire of this. And I think if you look at the other side of that coin, executives are stressed out. Like the numbers of executives who report being burnout is well into the 60%, close to 60%,
Mm-hmm.
with a significant percentage of those people saying that their burnout is extreme. And so that is, and if you look CEO tenure, it's shrunk dramatically over the last few years, up to 3 years. I don't think that the people leading these divisions, these organizations, are thriving, right? If the IBM study on complexity for 6 years ago, in the much simpler times of 2019, over half of CEOs doubted their personal ability, 51% of them doubted their personal ability to manage the coming complexity in their industries and didn't think their organizations could manage it. The percentage of executives who have faith in their organizations actually being able to do something, it's below 40%. So this is a highly stressful leadership environment. Us leaders, we're not thriving, right?
Yeah.
And so we have the leaders who are suffering on one side because they have too much responsibility on their shoulders. They have been given a task that is impossible for them to achieve. And on the other side, you have their employees who want more, right? So I think that this is a perfect time. We are there. It is just, and I think we're starting to see it, right? My conversations with executives, they're scared. Like they don't know how to answer these questions, and they know that they will never be able to figure it out. Because remember, these are emergent, recombinant threats. These are, they haven't finished developing. We don't know how they're going to affect, and they're combining, creating in different threats. And those things are coming at us at an exponentially faster rate. And so, I think as we develop into this, there will be some leaders who start to see this. And so I agree with you. I am, and we're trying to figure it out. We were speaking to, an executive of one of the FANG companies about what we're doing. And he was just like, I don't know if I can excel. I don't think I can describe this. This is so complex. It's a real great storytelling challenge for me to figure out is how is it that we can, speak this in a way. A lot of what I do is my work is public speaking. So people hear me speak and they say, yes, that's it. And so the few who are on the edge of seeing this, they peel off and they connect with me through those conversations. And for what we're trying to accomplish at this point in time, that's more than enough. And we're confident that will build momentum over time as things get more complex. And but remember, our methodologies are not normal consulting. We don't want to be there forever. We want to give you some tools. We want to let you use those tools and experiment with those tools and call us in when you need help. But if we're super successful, you won't need to. And I think that there's enough. This transition is big enough that it'll keep us busy until it's done, and then when it's done, there'll be plenty of other opportunities.
I mentioned earlier, good to great. One of the core principles was ensuring that you have the right people in the right seats on the bus, and that probably does reflect well in distributed leadership, where you do have to, as a leader, ensure that you're not just distributing accountability. You're making sure you have the right people in the right seats. They have the right capabilities to operate within those seats. But then and then here's where the difference is. It's not just the right people in the right seats, but then you empower them in their own way to drive those seats. And so it's not just one bus driver, it's distributed bus driving, which is of course counterintuitive. That's got to be the tough part of it. But then it does mean your people are so much more important than ever before. And so I learned a long time ago that when I have an employee who figures stuff out, I latch onto them and I keep them as long as possible, and I support them, I motivate them, I drive them, because they're the kinds of people that we need more and more. Not somebody who has a resume that says I did this and this and this, although that stuff is fine, that stuff is good, but someone who is in fact a figure outer. Doesn't matter if they don't have enough resources. Doesn't matter if they don't have clear accountabilities. Doesn't matter if the vision isn't totally cleanly clear. They figure things out, and when you get them, you hold on to them for dear life. And if you can manage to build an organization where it doesn't have to be everybody, but there's a certain critical mass of those kinds of people, if you can build that kind of organization, then I can see distributed leadership really thriving and just changing the nature of business in our world today. You also said it's not just a U.S. issue. This is absolutely a global issue. I see both the upsides and the downsides throughout the world in terms of the clients that we're consulting with, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Two things that I wanted to bring up, and I was speaking to a woman. She had her doctorate in history, focusing on blues and jazz, and she is running a fascinating organization helping international students get acclimated, to U.S. higher education and figuring that out. Dr. Jackie Modeste, and so her thesis was on her PhD thesis was on blues and jazz, and so she uses the principles of jazz composition to run her business, because she is in environments where, as an American, there are conversations about her, that impede her ability to be successful. There are assumptions about her. And so she needs to play but it was her understanding of jazz structure that allowed her to be successful. And one of my mentors, Vern Harnish, who wrote a book, called, he's, I was going to say Good to Great. He did not write Good to Great, but he talks about Jim Collins a lot. But he wrote a book called Mastering the Rockefeller Habits that was rebranded as Scaling Up. But he taught me that structure, is critical. And it's, when we look at jazz, it looks like a bunch of old guys who are just jamming and having fun. But jazz is actually the most highly structured form of music there is, and it is the structure that allows for the improvisation. So in talking to Dr. Jackie, I realized I got to study jazz, because there is a framework here for when, and she brought up something that I thought was fascinating. The trumpet player needs to be listening to what the saxophone player is doing, because you're composing as you are performing, right? This is never the same once. So you have to listen to what one person is doing and what the story they're telling, and then tell part of that story from your point of view, from your instrumentation. But you can't do something totally different. You can't do what you want. It has to fit within the context of what you're doing. So,
and that's such an acquired skill. I mean, if you've ever listened to let's say a less than great high school jazz band, where the individual players have not developed yet that that ear for listening to others while while I'm also playing my instrument. It can be a horrible experience.
Yes.
So you're right. It's interesting. You said old guys, playing jazz. That's where you see that level of experience and discernment. So Peter, I again, an hour has gone by so
So
rapidly.
fast.
This is fantastic. I really do appreciate this, and we'll make sure anyone who wants to reach out to you, they'll have the contact information in the show notes of the podcast, and I am sure, I have no doubt that this is going to be the start of ongoing conversations, not just about distributed leadership, but a variety of other things as well. So I really appreciate it. Any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
Well, I think, I want to quote someone else, a woman, Professor Ruha Benjamin out of Princeton. And she pointed out this study, I heard one of her talks, is that NASA developed a study to identify highly creative, divergent thinkers. And they had a researcher some time ago administered that test to a group of 4 and 5-year-olds and found out that 97% of them scored off the charts when it came to creative geniuses. 97% of them. And then he did that same test year after year, and every year about 12% of those students slipped below that average. To the end, we reached just 4% are targeted as creative geniuses. Now, I think about that a lot. And I think, Ruha Benjamin's work is, who is it within an organization or in the world who has the permission, the ability to be creative? Yeah, and what happens when we give that permission to more people? And what I hear her saying is that creative genius ability will start to decline again. So I think that we are there. We look at this. Going back to your chicken and egg. I think the chicken and egg question is not are my people creative enough to handle the control, but what will happen and how will their creativity evolve once they have it? And I think that is the more pertinent question.
And does our approach to leadership cause creativity and innovation to blossom or to die on the vine? So in many ways, distributed leadership is about distributed innovation and distributed creativity, which is a fantastic framing of what we're trying to do for organizations. So thank you so much. Thank you. This is again been a great talk, and we'll talk again soon, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.